Thank you. And it's really good to be here with you all tonight, and those of you who are joining us virtually as well. I know that the title talks about the dwindling congregation, and I want to acknowledge that's part of it. I think Dave and I are going to be coming at it from a place of hope and possibility. So the way I'd like to frame this at the beginning, though, is to read you a passage of Scripture. A lot of you will be familiar with it in its usual translation, Proverbs 29:18, where there is no vision, the people perish. I happen to like what Eugene Peterson put it as in saying, if people can't see what God is doing, they stumble all over themselves. But when they attend to what God reveals, they are most blessed. Dave and I did this presentation for a group of pastors this past Saturday just to kind of get some input from them. And I asked them, how many of you are clueless, let's just say clueless, or have no clear idea of what God is doing in the pandemic? I'm going to ask you all the same question. How many of you have no clear idea what God's doing with the pandemic? Yeah, that was pretty consistent. And how many of you feel like we might be stumbling all over ourselves right now trying to figure things out? Yeah, so a couple of hands went way high up, so absolutely. In talking through this, and this is a conversation Dave and I started a few months ago at his initiative, and I'm so grateful for it because it was just kind of what I needed to be thinking. I do want to acknowledge the dwindling congregation part. In our presbytery alone, over the last 3 years, we've closed 3 congregations. We closed Ebenezer, which was an open country church in Henry County, not too far from Louisville, if you know where that is, on Highway 40. We closed the church in downtown Greenfield, even though Greenfield is growing like gangbusters these days. And we closed St. Andrew Presbyterian Church on the west side, on Kessler Boulevard, South Drive, I think it is. So there are congregations that are dwindling, that are struggling. And yet, in the midst of that, I think there is some tremendous hope on the horizon. In our presbytery right now, we have a new worshiping community that is associated with Westminster Neighborhood Services. A lot of you may know that. It's on the Near East Side. It's a long-time presbytery-supported ministry. When the church closed a few years ago, the congregation, we didn't have a Presbyterian presence there. Jim Riley, the associate pastor for discipleship at Second Presbyterian, retired and said, I'm not done with ministry yet. I'd like to do something. And he and a group of people are doing what is called Circle City Dinner Church out of Westminster. They were able to continue that even during the worst days of the pandemic. They serve a meal on a regular basis, and they did that by doing kind of drop-off dinners during the pandemic, but they also prayed with those who came. Now that things are a little more flexible, their goal is to do dinner with a worship service around the tables. Very informal, a short message, a little bit of songs by a group or just from the folks who are there, and prayer with the individuals, a lot of whom are poor, way below the poverty line. A lot of them have other struggles with addictions, or they're just out of prison or whatever. They are the folks from that neighborhood. On a usual Wednesday when things were going well, they would have 75 people show up for Circle City Dinner Church. To me, that is Christ's body being active in a new way. We have a group in Fort Wayne that are Burmese refugees that have approached us. They have a strong Presbyterian heritage. they'd like to become a part of the presbytery. So again, there are hopeful things happening. And I think one of the things that this kind of fits into is some of the other ways that God has already been working. 3 years ago, my two colleagues in the other two presbyteries, Ohio Valley, where Susan McGee is the executive presbyter, and Wabash Valley, where Jennifer Burns-Lewis is the visioning and strategizing presbyter, and I put together an idea for how congregations might get coaching. A lot of pastors get coaching. A lot of you, maybe in your professional life, have a coach. But we didn't know of anybody who was actually coaching congregations that wanted to do something new. And we put this together. We pulled together a cadre of coaches. We found 8 congregations in the 3 presbyteries that wanted to do this as a pilot. One of them is First Presbyterian Church of Bluffton, which I think has a wonderful story. They have lots of property, and they realized during the pandemic that they wanted a way for people to be able to express their spirituality without having to come inside the church. And I guess for many years, there's been a dream of doing a labyrinth on that property. They built the labyrinth, but they went a step further and made it accessible for handicapped people to be able to do. So it took an additional kind of expense to put into that, but their coach helped them figure out how they could get there. And now this is a gift not just to that church and to that congregation, but to the whole community of Bluffton, for people who might never come inside First Presbyterian Church of Bluffton. So there's some things that are happening that I think represent what can be, what might be. And Dave and I, and I'm going to turn it over to him here in a minute, have observed that some congregations are feeling stuck right now. The pandemic has just kind of paralyzed a lot of stuff. All the energy was into how do we do church right now? How do we have a worship service? How do we call on the sick when we can't even go to the hospital? All those kinds of things. But as we're gearing up to maybe have the worst of the pandemic behind us, we also know that there maybe needs to be some conversation of how do you get unstuck? How do you move forward now and embrace new things? Because we won't go back to what people think was normal. We're not going back. The church nowhere is going back. I meet with a group of denominational, they're my counterparts in all the denominations in Indiana. We meet virtually on Thursday mornings, and tomorrow is our morning to meet. We used to gather in person, but that limited it only to the folks that were here in Indianapolis. During the pandemic, we made that broader. We don't want to go back to where it was just the folks here in Indianapolis. But we also know that there are some adjustments that we'll have to make over time. Dave and I are having this conversation, and we want to include you as well as some pastors that we've talked to in having it as well. And I'm going to let him kind of take it from there because he's done a lot of the legwork on thinking this through, and we've just had good conversation about what direction that might take. So Dave?
I'd like to thank Alan for being here. Really appreciate him coming out on this Wednesday evening. And a thank you to the staff that have helped put all this together. Jeff Schmall especially, and Tim and others that are making this possible. And John, thank you. I love the baseball illustration to start off. I wanted on record that I did not start with a sports illustration that you did. And I believe another line from that movie is, if you build it, they will come. And you know, that really represents how we have operated for so long in the traditional mainline church. You know, we had this sense that we would end up in a location, we would build a church and hang out this sign, and people would show up. And that's how we have approached our lives for so long. And the church landscape started to change, especially about 20 to 30 years ago for the mainline church. And we know this change was happening, but we weren't quite sure what to do with it. And we've been very slow to get a handle on the fact that this landscape has changed so much. You just can't be the mainline, the Presbyterian church on the corner and expect people to show up anymore. One of the waves that was flowing over us is the independent church movement. And that has had a big impact on mainline congregations, and we've tried to figure out how do we navigate with that movement, and now the pandemic has hit. I really believe, and I'm hearing more and more, that for many organizations, the pandemic is going to be an accelerator. And I'd like you to think about that. It's going to accelerate if a congregation or organization was struggling and declining. There is a very good chance that the pandemic is going to accelerate that decline. On the other hand, we talk about the life cycle of a congregation or an organization, and many of our mainline congregations have kind of, long since been at their peak. And if you know that life cycle, they're on the downside of that life cycle, the dwindling church line. But the pandemic can also be an accelerator to help churches change that arc that they currently find themselves on. And we're going to share that the challenge rests with some dilemmas that our churches are facing, and very interested in how you feel about these. We have members of congregations here, we have some clergy here, and truly, Alan and I would like to know if you can see what we're talking about, these challenges. And I believe for us to use the pandemic as an accelerator to change the arc of so many of the life cycles of our gathered communities, we need to be aware of some of these dilemmas and figure out how we're going to get through them. First of all, we're putting this together as we come through this pandemic in a little bit of a medical model, because what we're talking about in response to making an accelerator for growth is we have to think of urgent care versus long-term research study. When you go to an urgent care clinic, you walk in and you're triaged pretty quickly, and then you're given a treatment plan. Now, so often, the way that we approach this kind of a study in a mainline church like the Presbyterian church, where we tend to be cerebral, is that we got to study it. And we will take months to study it. And then we'll come up with some conclusions. And then we'll take a few more months to figure out how we put those into action. And then it'll be a little longer before it actually shows up as materials. And I think what we're going to experience as we start to come out of this pandemic is going to be this window of opportunity. And so we need to try to help position our churches, once again, to use this as an accelerator, to be ready to go and to think and operate in a mode that we're not used to. How can we help them get 1, 2, or 3 initiatives ready to go in a short period of time? And here's kind of the dilemma that frames all this. One of the big learnings that has come out of the pandemic, and I've heard this said that it was really felt most powerfully in 30 and 40-somethings, is that we have this tremendous need for community. People discovered that while they had a lot of contacts, they maybe didn't have many contacts that were very deep. They really lacked a sense of community in their lives. And now we have so many people that are desperate to seek this out. Do you see how this gets framed right away? So we have these mainline churches, and just about any mainline church you'd go to would say, wow, we really wish we had more younger people, younger families. And one of the things that really exemplifies these churches is that they are a wonderful community that cares for each other. And we have got younger people out here looking for a community. And we're missing each other. We're just missing each other. And here is this incredible opportunity for who we are. And it's how the first century church grew. Their community, they were known for their community, and it was so attractive to people, they were coming because they wanted to be part of what they saw. So, kind of frames what you're going to see now, these four dilemmas. And once again, I want you to be thinking of your own church experience and if these make sense to you. But I want you to be thinking in terms of this urgent care approach and how we can share who we are. So the first dilemma is how we manage energy. In so many of our churches now, we only have a limited number of people. And we have some very faithful people. In fact, we often have a limited group of people doing a lot of different things. And I've one time heard it said, I know the congregation I came from, a little bit bigger congregation than this, somebody got with me early on and said, this place is so frustrating. We have so many groups of 20 people doing stuff, and I don't think we even know anymore why they're doing what they're doing. But they keep doing it. And I think we all can maybe relate to this. We have a lot of activity going on, a lot of things that are happening. But the problem is that we are dissipating the energy that is being brought to us is being dissipated across a lot of these activities. There's energy there. Once again, the dilemma sets up. There's energy there, but it's just being dissipated by a lot of activity, a lot of stuff that's going on that we're not even too sure exactly what some of these groups are doing. And I think under this dilemma, too, we can think of stewardship. You know, this tremendous and so valuable of a resource of people's time and energy. Do we have a sense of how it's being used at this critical inflection point that we're moving into as a church? So, again, you can think about that. I think in most of our congregations, you know what I'm talking about. And you know, there's even groups that continue to meet that, you know, sometimes people aren't even sure, you know, why they meet anymore, but they keep getting together and keep coming. All right, we'll go to the second dilemma, and this is really the heart of the matter. You know, managing energy will flow through these four, but the real heart of the matter, and here we're doing this presentation at Northminster. Many people here have participated in a visioning retreat, but the heart of the matter is this need to rediscover a vision. Now let me give you some definitions here. You know, first of all, I want to tell a little story. Staying with the medical theme, I hope this will be appropriate. In my early days in Western Pennsylvania, I was the executive director of a camp conference ground. One summer, we had a little girl who was really pretty severely injured. Won't go into how it happened or all the details, but ended up in the emergency room. I was there because she was, again, injured pretty badly, and the nurse from the camp was there, and the emergency room doctor was working on her with some others, and she had a number of lacerations. And I remember as I was standing there very clearly, there was one laceration on her arm that was really bleeding, and the doctor was ignoring it and doing other stuff. And I finally spoke up. I said, "Whoa, that one on the arm's really bleeding." And the doctor ignored me, kept doing what he was doing. And so I waited a little bit, and I'm like, "Hey, you know, when I came in, I saw where the gauze is. I could grab some and put it on there." And then finally the doctor looked up to me, and he said, "You know," he was working in the trunk area. He said, "If we don't establish what is happening with the heart and the lungs, nothing else matters. It's not going to be important. And I think that's what recovering vision is about in the life of the church. If we don't know what's critical to our very life going forward, all that other stuff we do, not going to matter. It is just not going to matter. One of the things Alan and I had talked about with this is we need to redefine terms, because we use mission and vision and we interchange them, and we use purpose, and it all gets very confusing. I know a number of you in your places of work, probably the same thing happens. You talk about your vision, you talk about your mission, you talk about your purpose statement, and we think, first of all, that we need to define terms, and we've done that in the life of this congregation. To us, mission is the timeless statement. Mission is why an organization was started to begin with. You know, this church was probably a mission, maybe of the presbytery, maybe of another congregation. So mission is your timeless statement that may relate even back to the first century church. Vision is, what are you looking to do in the near term? You know, what do we believe God is calling us to do in the next 2 to 3 years? And vision is at its best when it's contextual. You know, not only have I seen a lot of confusion between a mission and a vision, but I have seen so many boilerplate vision statements. It could be the vision statement for any congregation. You know, one classic one is, our new vision is we're going to love God and love others. And that's great. You know, that's a great statement. But how does that relate to where you are placed right now, the location your congregation is, in your context, with your mix of gifts in the congregation? How does that relate to what you are being called to do specifically in the next 2 or 3 years? Because when we can get that defined, then that allows us to move into some focused planning. I think it's a difficult work to do because, as Alan and I talked about it, good vision writing is a little bit of an art form. You know, when people say, well, how do you do that? How do you get there? You know, there's a little bit of an art form to it, to be able to take usually a lot of information and to get it into that concise, contextual statement is not easy. And something else that I believe is critical is that there has to be some outside influence in this work. And I've had this argument and discussion in various places and even at some conferences where it's recommended that the visioning work is done exclusively by the members of the congregation that have been there for a number of years. Now, if you just step back and think about it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, because the chances are they're not going to come up with anything new and creative. And so the developing of that core vision statement often takes a little outside help, because then when you have the vision, we can move to what are those 1 or 2 aligned initiatives or priorities that this congregation needs to get onto now to truly make it an accelerator. You know, what are those 1 or 2 initiatives? And there's a lot of other things that are important. There's a lot of other historical work we can do. But what do we really need to do? What is God calling us to do right now, right here, as we look to the future? And I don't know, Alan, if there's anything else you want to comment on that one, or you?
We can come back.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. There's 2 more. I think once, and again, these do build on each other. I think another one of our dilemmas is that we do keep track and count some things in the life of the congregation. I don't know if we're always counting all the things we need to be aware of. Because when you create that focused vision and you have then that 1 or 2 initiatives that you're ready to use, we need to keep track. Are we following through on this stuff? So often our churches put so much time and effort into keeping track of finances. 4 o'clock this afternoon, had a finance committee meeting, and boy, we go into detail. Big detail. Do we need to split this one into 2 line items or 3 line items? And now, is that number, are we sure that number is supposed to be there? Is that number maybe supposed to be over here? A lot of detail, a lot of keeping track. We don't really track much else in the church like that. And I wonder if we're going to, as we build this, help churches move quickly to that focused vision statement with 1 or 2 initiatives. What do we really need to be tracking around those 1 or 2 initiatives? I've been in churches where the elders gather every month, and they really have no idea how many kids they have in their Sunday school. They don't know how many kids attend a youth group. They don't know how many people participated in some of the mission opportunities that were offered. And these are all critical pieces for the church, but we don't keep track of it. So what we'd like to recommend is moving beyond just that fixation on our finances, not that we're not going to track them. Oh my, we'll still track them. And report it to the presbytery and the denomination too. But we need to do a little bit more than that. And then finally, it's to rediscover what, for all of this to really have the energy it needs going forward, what are some simple leadership competencies we need to once again be sure we have in the life of the church? Some years ago, I was at a church, and we were going to do a major capital campaign, raise a few $1 million, and we had an organization that was helping us do that. And part of the campaign effort, the team, you put together these different teams. One of the teams was a prayer team. And so here we have these bunch of Presbyterians, and we're looking at this capital campaign, and we're doing our organizational work. And a couple of the leaders after our first meeting came up to me and said, we're not going to do that prayer team thing, are we? I said, well, yeah, I think we really need to do the prayer. Oh, really? And, we'll take people from other teams. I said, no, we need to do the prayer team. And sure enough, we put a prayer team together, and this group of about 10 people, they were surprised that people were willing to be on it, met every week for an hour and just prayed for the congregation and the campaign and the vision of what we were trying to do. And then about 2 months later, we had people who, as we launched everything and started to talk to people, we had people questioning the results because they were stunning to us, how people were responding to this campaign, and people were questioning the bookkeeping. And you had to remind us that we had people praying. We had people praying that this would happen. And it's happening. And again, the Presbyterian's like, oh, okay, yeah. I think we've lost sometimes some of these basic competencies, even as a Christian church, because if you think about all of this relates, we have so much energy. We have so much energy from a set group of people that we have to use so wisely in all of this. But we understand that the Spirit is present in the church and that the Spirit will take and multiply that energy, but we have to be open to that. I think there's other competencies that we can develop that help us live together, and we often put those under emotional intelligence of just how we talk to each other, how we are covenanting to be sure to go directly to people and not form our little groups that get together and talk about something that is happening in the life of the church, because we just don't have the energy to spend on any of that anymore. See, we're way past if you build it, they will come. And so we have to be so aware of what we're doing with the resources we have left because of this incredible opportunity. So the development in the midst of all this of 1 or 2 of very clearly laid out spiritual competencies, and a couple emotional competencies are key. So that is really what we are saying is our hope looking to the future in the state that we find ourselves in, our congregations at various different places, and staying with our urgent care or immediate care concept. We believe there are some immediate care type resources that can be provided to help our congregations, help all of us, move through these at that faster pace that we need to right now in order to really be open to this accelerator that can be part of the pandemic. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your patience and attention. I don't know if maybe you've experienced these four kind of dilemmas, how they set up in the life of the congregation. We'll see if Alan wants to throw in a few comments, and then we'll open up. I think we do have a little bit of time here for a few questions. But Alan, anything else you want?
Yeah, I was just going to make an observation. It occurred to me while you were talking. I hadn't thought of it before. In the years before I became the executive presbyter, I did some church consulting, and I was called out to do a conflict intervention with a church, a Presbyterian church that was close to a military base. So as you might imagine, their worshiping community had a very transient population, and then a few who were there all the time. What would happen in this church is somebody came and get real involved, and they were with the military, and they'd start a new program, and then they'd move on. They'd get transferred or whatever. But the program didn't go away. So they had all of these programs that they were continuing to do, and they were upset with their pastor because he wasn't present at all of them. And when I was finished with the consultation, I told them, just listening to them, and all that they were doing was exhausting. And that, I think I was there in May, in early May. I said, my recommendation to you is that you take the summer coming up and don't do anything except worship together and pray together. I said, because I think it's in that time that you'll discern what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And it kind of goes to what we're talking about here. It's the pandemic as an accelerator. There are a lot of things that have been put on hold that folks can't wait to get back to. It may not be healthy for a church to go back to all of what they did before. And so how do you say, now's the time to manage the energy, to get a clear sense of your vision so that you know what are we supposed to do now, and then to develop the metrics to track that, as well as the competencies in the congregation that will help that happen. That's it really, that happened in probably 2007, so like 15 years ago, that was going on in a church. And again, I think we're going to see all kinds of churches. Dave and I were comparing notes just before this began of how many churches with congregations that don't have a staff besides the pastor, where the pastor has done everything in the pandemic. They did the live streaming. They did the music. They did the sermon, and they're exhausted now. And they certainly don't want to go back to doing everything they were doing before. So it's going to invite our congregations. I don't want to say it's going to force them, because I think God is always about invitation rather than forcing us. But it is an invitation for us to look and be clear about what the church is going forward. So.
Great. So I think we do have a few minutes anyway for possibly a couple questions, and I think people are given a card to write a question on or that. So, Gary.
One I would ask while we're waiting for those is, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem in dealing with resources and time and all of that. Is it better to pick the things you're going to cut out first before you decide what you're going to do with that time, or is it better to decide what you want to do with that time and then figure out what to cut out?
You know, I think for me, it all goes back to the heart of the matter, and that is developing that vision. You know, what do you believe God is calling, you to do at this time? And I can't emphasize enough how that has to be contextual to who you are and where you find yourself placed. And I think once you decide on what that vision is, then you have that ability to kind of make the decisions, what stays, what we may cut out. And like Alan said, maybe we'll rest most everything and just decide we're going to put it all in on these one or two new initiatives and pause some of the other things we've been doing for a while because we just have to try something different in this very unique moment. So I think it's the vision and what flows naturally from the vision.
Are there things to be learned from the growth of the independent churches without significantly changing what the mainline church offers?
Yeah, for sure. The independent church movement is definitely a fascinating movement. And as we talk about the dwindling mainline church, I believe many of those churches are also now experiencing some decline as well. But one of the things about the independent church movement is that, we were in such a maintenance mode as a mainline church in what we were doing. And we did just keep doing the same things over and over without much thought. Were people really relating to what we were doing as the mainline church? And it didn't mean that we had to completely throw out everything, but how could we do what we do in fresh ways as we move forward? So that was one of, I think, of the challenges of the mainline church. Another piece to the independent church movement has to do with the age of the churches, and this is a difficult one to talk about, but some of you have heard me talk about this, that as we look to opportunities, we spend a lot of our time, our people time, our resources on caring for many people in our church, seniors in our church, shut-ins in our church, and a lot of our time and energy of effort is put into that. And some of these huge mega churches have 3 people over 75. So they're not putting any of their resources, time resources, financial resources, and that caring for people is who we are as a community. Very important. But I think it does put us in a position where it's hard for us to think of the new initiatives and the creative initiatives because we don't have that kind of time available. And I don't know if you have any other thoughts on it.
And I think the other thing is we, in the main line, are connectional for the most part. So we have the support of one another when things are tough. And independent churches, I think they're coming up against the realities that they can only count on themselves a lot of times. There are some frustrations, obviously, of being Presbyterian and doing things the way we do. We deliberate things to death. We take forever to get to a decision. But at the end, I think it's more widely embraced. And then if there's a struggle, like with this church that I went to, I came at the invitation of somebody else's executive presbyter back then because I had something that was of benefit to them at that time. So, yeah.
And I think many of those independent megachurches are often built around one personality.
Yep.
And that's, so what that means is then when that person is there no longer, very often, and we can give you many illustrations of some big independent churches known around the country, they really struggle. The other challenge there is lack of accountability, too, very often.
Yep.
There are 2 questions here that overlap a little bit, so I'll let you guys sort them out the way you'd like. One is, how do you develop spiritual competencies? And the second is, what are some examples of outside input for planning? Maybe those are connected in what you would say, but take them as you would like.
Yeah. I don't know.
So the spiritual competencies, really, I think it goes back to Dave's illustration a while ago about having a prayer team. You develop those things by devoting yourself to it. And, prayer is a key spiritual competency. So is discernment. And discernment is about listening throughout a process. It's kind of like what the PNC at Northminster is doing. They are discerning, together. It's not a quick process. It's an intentional process. And they are listening to each other. They're listening for the Spirit. So it's about doing it. I think it's key.
And I think the outside influence can relate back to what Alan mentioned about coaches. When you have people gather together and they are just so familiar, it's like how you miss things in our own homes. Maybe a project is half done and you've just gotten used to it, and so you're not finishing it, but somebody comes in your home, or you walk into a home and go, wow, that room's half decorated, what's going on? And I think that happens to us within the church. We become so used to how we've operated, what we see, that when you come to do a visioning process, if there's not somebody else that can come in and say, hey, wait a minute, you're talking about needing young families. Do you know that you're sitting in the middle of, and I think we figured out here, of a 3-block radius, there's around 1,000 homes. And many of them have young families, and it's like, hey, so just that little bit of an objective, separated view from someone who can maybe push or bring to light. It reminds me of coaching. What coaching is at its best, I think. Not telling you what to do, but just helping you see some of the other opportunities. Right. Where do you go for? Well, that's what I think we're trying to develop in a program like this. Is to we're gathering a group of churches that are going to do this kind of program as a pilot, that we can personally help along a little bit, but other coaches, other people that can be trained to come in and help. And very often it's even a person like Alan. I would do the a neighboring pastor or pastor from a few towns over that can come in or very active leaders in a church come in and help a church think through some of what they're doing based on that community and what they know about it.
It sounds a little similar to what a transitional or an interim pastor would
do,
right?
That could be, yeah.
I don't know, these things sounded familiar. Okay, here's another question. How do we deal with the cultural relevance of Sunday mornings? Church is competing with other activities and has rearranged the priorities and the time of 20-somethings. So what can we do to deal with that?
So I think that's one of the cutting edge things. That's the vision. Who determined that Sunday morning was the only time that worship occurs? I think we all got handed that, and we all grew up with it. But the pandemic has shown us not only do you not have to attend your church in person, you can be with somebody else's church across the country for a while, virtually. And again, there's things we're going to have to figure out. How do you build community virtually? But again, yes, there are competitions, and that's the world we live in. But a church that says, okay, we acknowledge all of that. We're going to find a worship time that really will speak to our context. If there are young families and that time is Saturday morning before the kids get up, then so be it. It still honors God.
That's right, and I think churches are experimenting and have discovered different times that might be appropriate. Smaller groups that get together, and not only are they a study group, but they almost are a worshiping group. And I think this is something that has really opened up for us, that we need to continue to look at. There's been some the online debate goes on, and some of you are aware of a New York Times article here, I think last week. A clergy person from Manhattan said, I think all online services should cease. We need to get people back in the pews, and there may be some truth to that, but we've certainly discovered that with some of our online opportunities,
Right.
we can create churches in different ways, different worshiping communities.
And the final question, maybe we just use this to wrap up. This would be a good test for. Oh, we have more? Yeah.
Accelerated that. Yeah. Yeah. That's good.
Would one of you repeat that question so that
Sure.
people watching?
Sure. Bob here asked this question about the measuring, what we measure, but then picking up on the whole finance issue and talking about the pandemic as an accelerator. It's accelerated concern over finances in congregations. So we're even holding tighter to what we have and how we look at what we have and what we're going to do, moving forward. So to talk about, hey, you need to get new vision and new initiatives going, those two can seem to be a bit of a dilemma. And part of what we believe needs to happen and why starting something like this in Indianapolis makes a lot of sense is that we think grants should be provided so that as churches look at, we want to do some new initiatives, that they're going to need some financial support to do those, so they can just breathe and realize that if they feel they're managing fewer dwindling finances, that we can boost them some with some dollars to help them try to get some of these initiatives going. Is that correct?
And
the presbytery is going to pay for it? No.
Okay, the final question, which is a good test of people's memory here, remind us at Northminster what our new vision statement is.
Yeah. And I think
Do you want to answer that one, Dave?
Yeah, I think and I've been around some great vision statements here. It's engaging neighbors because of where we near and far. So it really means near. We have to engage the neighbors that are right around us, but also, the mission and outreach is so critical to this church that it involves more than the people that are just near. So engaging neighbors near and far in Christ's love. And I think that's a great contextual, concise vision statement. Some of the other ones I've been around that I like is community that matters. I think is a great vision statement right now for what we're going through. Another vision statement I like is creating pathways. A church that felt they had a lot to offer. They had a lot of people that weren't church in their community, and they're like, hey, we have to create pathways for people to find how to get into our place, and then how do we get out with what we believe, the good news, to others. So, yeah, a little bit on vision statements.
Okay. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much to our presenters for being here, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah.
Yes.